Hi, and welcome to our first episode of CCM In-Depth. My name is Deacon Matt, and I'm the Catholic Campus Minister at Western Carolina University. And this is a new series that we are bringing to you where we look in depth at a particular issue of relevance to our faith. And we're hoping to come out with these episodes at least once a month for now. And for this first episode, we're going to be looking at moral issues around voting. We are less than a month away from a presidential election. And a lot of people are seeking guidance on who they should vote for in this campaign. And election season is always a very contentious time, especially national elections, and most especially when we have the election of a president. It's an important moment in the life of our country. And so people are taking this very seriously, as they should. Now, we also live in a time when politics tends to be very divisive. We tend to be divided around politics rather than united. And so election season can be a very divisive time, which is unfortunate, but that's the reality of the moment. And this is true even among Catholics. It can divide Catholics from each other. And we also live in a time when politics, especially political campaigns, tend to be very negative. And what I mean by that is that rather than highlighting the good points about their own candidate, campaign organizations tend these days to focus on the negative aspects of the opposing candidate. So in other words, rather than tell us, here's a list of reasons why you should vote for our candidate, they say, here's a list of reasons why you shouldn't vote for this candidate, why that would be bad. And this focus on the negative leaves, many Americans feeling as though instead of voting for the candidate that we think is the best person for the job, what we're actually doing is voting against the candidate that we think would be the worst person for the job. And this focus from both sides on how bad the other candidate is has led some people to wonder, it's like, am I committing a sin if I vote for the wrong candidate? And indeed, I'm sure you've heard the claim that you can do that Catholics are actually sinning if they vote for a certain candidate. And you'll hear that claim from Catholics on both sides of the political spectrum about either candidate, that you're sinning if you vote for that person. So that's what we're going to be talking about in this video today. Is it a sin to vote for a certain candidate? And I want to be very upfront about what I'm not going to be talking about. I'm not going to be telling you how to vote. I'm not going to tell you how I'm going to vote. This video is not an endorsement or a condemnation of either candidate or party. In fact, I don't even plan on mentioning either candidate or political party because I want this video to be universally relevant to any political election that you might take part in. And so what I'm going to be doing is focusing on that specific question. Is it a sin to vote for a certain candidate? And we're going to be looking at that from the perspective of moral theology. We're going to look at the principles involved and that need to be kept in mind when we answer that question so that no matter who you vote for, you can vote with a clear conscience. So let's begin. First thing we need to do is take a step back and ask a broader question. Is it possible to sin when voting at all? Is it possible to commit a sin when you're voting? And the answer is yes, it is. It is possible to sin when voting because voting involves the exercise of a virtue, and sin, or one definition of sin anyway, is a failure in virtue. That's why habitual sin is called a vice, which is the opposite of virtue. And since voting involves exercising a virtue, if you fail in that virtue when you vote, you would be committing a sin. So the specific virtue that's involved in voting in an election is the virtue of prudence. Prudence is that virtue that helps our reason to discern the correct course of action in any given situation and inspire our will to follow it. So it helps our reason to discern what the best course of action is and then inspires our will to follow it. Prudence involves the use of our conscience, which is that tool of our intellect that helps us to decide what the right thing to do is in any given situation. And practicing the virtue of prudence requires us to do three things. We can break it down into three parts. Number one, we have to consider the available information that's relevant to our decision that we have to make. Two, we make a judgment based on that about the right thing to do. And this is where conscience comes into play. And then the third aspect of prudence is putting that judgment into action. We actually have to do the thing that we judge to be the right course of action. Consider the available information, make a judgment about what the right thing to do is, and then put that judgment into action. So when we vote, we exercise prudence by considering all of the relevant information that's available to us about the candidates and their policies, whatever issues may be involved in that particular election, to make a judgment about which candidate would be best suited for the position. And then finally, we put that judgment into action when we cast our ballots. So that's how voting involves the virtue of prudence. And when we consider everything that's involved in voting prudently, when it's broken down like that, we can see how it would be possible to sin against prudence when we vote if we fail in one of those three areas. We can either fail to consider all the relevant information that's available to us. We can fail to make a right judgment about the information that's available. Or we can fail to put that judgment into action in the voting booth. So if we fail in either of those three areas, we're committing a sin against the virtue of prudence. And I want to talk a little bit more about just the first two of those things, which are considering all the relevant information and then making a judgment, because I'm assuming that most people who are concerned about who to vote for are actually planning on doing the third thing, which is to put that into action and actually go vote. They just might be conflicted over how to make a decision on who to vote for. So let's look at the first thing that's required to make a prudent judgment, and that is considering all the relevant information. And the most important thing that I want to say about this is that the information that's going to be available to us is always going to be incomplete. This is true. It's true not only with elections, it's true with any decision in which we're called to make a prudential judgment, because we human beings are limited in our knowledge, and we simply are never going to know every relevant thing about any given situation in which we might be called upon to make a decision. But we have to make a decision, right? We have to make a decision. So prudence is not about having all of the data, because that's just never going to happen. It's about making the best decision you can given the data that you have. And so given the fact that we can't know everything about the political candidates, what information is it reasonable for us to consider when deciding how to vote? Well, we'd want to have information about the policies that the candidates endorse. We'd want to have information about the policies of their respective parties, as well as information about the character of the candidates themselves. So let's talk about those things. Let's talk about the candidates' policies first, right? Policies are important for us to consider when we vote, because we're voting politicians into office in order to govern our country. And we want to make sure that they're going to govern our country in a way that's good and, well, prudent, right? And that's why we use prudence when we vote them into office. And their stated policies tell us something about how they intend to govern. And so it's important for us to consider not only the policies that are endorsed by the candidates themselves, but also by their respective political parties, because an individual candidate might not personally have made an express statement about every particular policy issue, but we can look at the policy platform of the party they belong to in order to get an idea about how that candidate might do things once they're in office. Because by and large, politicians tend to follow the policies of their respective parties. And when we consider the different policy positions of the candidates and their parties, we have to be careful about making certain distinctions, especially if we're considering the question, is it a sin if I vote for this candidate? Because most differences in policy involve things that people of good faith can disagree on. What I mean by that is this. It's possible for people to share good goals, to share the same good goals, but disagree about the best way to achieve those goals. For example, we all want to have a good economy. We all want to have access to good health care. We all want to have a good education for our children. We all want to have a strong national defense for our country. We all want less crime, right? All these things, we share those goals in common, but political parties, as well as individual candidates, can and do disagree on the best way to achieve those goals. So two candidates can share the same broad goal, for example, of reducing gun violence. They both want to reduce gun violence. I don't think any candidate would win on a platform of more gun violence, right? But they might have very different ideas on what the best way to reduce gun violence might be. And the same thing can be true about ways to stimulate our economy, or how to provide, adequate health care, or how to establish a more just immigration system. Just because politicians disagree on something, and even disagree strongly, it doesn't make one good and one evil. Right? And I want to be really clear on this because of the tendency that we have today in our political discourse to vilify our opponents. It's gotten to the point where if someone has a different political opinion than us, it's like suddenly they're ostracized, right? Or they're excommunicated. They've become the other. And so we need to remember that people of good faith can and do disagree on these things. People within the Catholic Church can and do disagree on these things, and it's okay. It doesn't make someone a bad Catholic or a bad Christian. And it's important to acknowledge this. And it's also important to acknowledge that very few of us are experts in all of these broad-ranging political issues. So what I mean by that is I'm not an economist, right? I don't know what the best way to grow our economy might be. So the prudent thing for me to do would be to consider the opinion of trusted people who are experts in economics, and then allow my opinion to be shaped by their guidance. Now that might require us to do a little bit more research on our own before forming our opinion. And it's perfectly okay for us not to have an opinion on a subject, even an important subject, if we don't know enough about that subject for our opinion to be informed. Sometimes today we really do feel like we have to have an opinion about everything, and we don't. Maybe I don't know enough about how our immigration system works to have a meaningful opinion on what the best way to fix it might be. Maybe I don't know enough about healthcare to really understand all of the issues in play. So before I form an opinion and make a judgment in these areas, I need to learn about them so that I can make an informed decision about these issues. And you can't just repeat the talking points of the political parties when you do that. You need to do your own research. Now, everything that I just said about people of good faith disagreeing on various matters is true for most political issues. But there are matters in politics today that don't simply involve differences of opinion about the best way to govern our country, but they deal directly with objective moral issues. And what I mean by objective moral issues are issues where there is a clear teaching from the church about what is right and what is wrong. These would be issues like abortion or euthanasia or same-sex marriage. These involve matters where the Catholic Church has a very clear teaching that these things are gravely sinful. And so if a candidate or a political party is advocating for something that is objectively immoral, a Catholic in good conscience cannot support that. And here is where sometimes people will argue, no, you need to keep religion out of politics. That's why we have separation between the church and the state. And that's true, except that issues of morality need to be considered separately from issues of theological doctrine or religious discipline. It would be wrong, for example, to try and force people by law to believe in the Trinity, or to mandate that every family has to have their babies baptized, or to outlaw eating meat on Fridays during Lent. Right? These are distinctively Catholic beliefs and practices. But the moral teachings of the church are different. They deal with what constitutes good and bad human behavior. And politics is all about regulating human behavior in society. So, of course, morality has to play a role in politics. And it does so, more often than we think, in ways that we take for granted all the time. So if we consider, for example, that the church has clear moral teachings about things like murder and rape and theft. And so for the good of society, we have laws against murder and rape and theft. Now, this doesn't mean that every single thing that the church teaches is immoral should also be made illegal, because that would mean it would be against the law just to sin, and there's no way that that could be enforced. But we do recognize that there are some immoral things that are so detrimental to society and so harmful to the individual that it is prudent for us to go ahead and legislate against these things for the common good of our society. And so the church teaches that murder is wrong, and we have laws against that. The church teaches that theft is wrong, and we have laws against that. Now, the church also teaches that lying is wrong, and we have laws against that. Granted, we don't have laws against, telling a white lie to your mom or something like that, but we do have laws against perjury in a courtroom and against libel and slander in certain contexts, and those things are for the good of society. So when a politician is positively advocating for something that the church teaches is not just a sin, but that's a grave evil and detrimental to the good of society, it would be wrong for a Catholic or for any person of goodwill to support that. And that's an important consideration, and we're going to come back to that in a little bit. But for right now, we just need to understand the distinction between policies that advocate for something that is objectively immoral and policies that advocate for something where there's room for a legitimate difference of opinion about what the best course of action might be for the good governance of our country. So, in deciding who to vote for, we need to consider the policies that are supported by the candidates and the policies of their parties. But we also need to consider the character of the candidates themselves. And you may have heard it said that elections should be about issues and not about candidates. But I disagree, because I think elections are absolutely about candidates. Because at the end of the day, we don't elect policies into office. We elect people into office. Policies don't govern. People do. And these people will be called upon to make countless important decisions as they govern our country. Do we trust them to make good decisions? They're going to face future situations that we just can't anticipate at the time of their election. Do we trust them to act prudently in those situations? And their character speaks to their ability to do this. Remember that the exercise of prudence involves due consideration of the available information. And when someone's elected into office, especially a high office, they're going to have access to a lot more relevant information than the general public when it comes to issues relating to the government of our country. And so we may not always understand or agree with the decisions that are made by our nation's leaders because they have access to information that we don't. And that's why it's important for us to elect people that we can trust to make good and prudent decisions on our behalf. And that's what we're doing. When we elect someone into office, we're essentially giving them the authority to make governing decisions for us. And that's why I think it's really important that we consider character along with the policies that they endorse. Because maybe they're advocating for all the right policies, but do they really mean it? Politicians are notorious for telling people what they want to hear, especially during an election campaign. So we might like their policies, but do we trust them to actually put those policies into action? That's a legitimate question, and their personal character speaks to that. So I believe that character is absolutely a consideration that we have to think about when we make a prudential decision on who to vote for. We want to elect virtuous people into office. So when deciding how to cast our vote, we need to ask, is this, to the best of my knowledge, a virtuous person? Can I trust them to make good decisions? So all of this that we've just discussed about considering policies and considering the character of the candidate, that all falls under that first rubric of getting relevant information that we need to consider in order to make a prudential judgment. If we cast our ballot without having done our due diligence to inform ourselves as to the policies and the character of the candidates that we're considering, then we've committed a sin against prudence. That's one way you can sin in the voting booth. Now, the second aspect of exercising prudence is to make a judgment about what the right course of action is. So, you might ask, what if I make a wrong judgment? What would that be a sin against prudence? And the answer is no, not really, as long as you made your judgment in good conscience, because voting's not like submitting an answer on a math test, right? There's not an answer sheet at the end to tell you which answer is right and which answer is wrong. Voting itself is not a matter of objective truth that you can either be right or wrong on. You're just making your best judgment about who the best person for this job might be. Maybe both candidates would do a good job. Right? We can hope that would be the case in a presidential election, that we'd have two good candidates, at either one of which would do a good job. Or maybe neither candidate would do a good job. My point is that the person that you thought was the best candidate at the time that you voted might go on to do a horrible job. And there was just no way for you to foresee that at the time, because no one can predict the future. Nor can we ever know what might have been, right? It could be that, yeah, your candidate that you elected into office did a horrible job, but maybe the other candidate would have done an even worse job. We don't know. We don't know. We can speculate, but you can never really say, oh, I voted for the wrong person with any kind of objective certainty. And this goes back to what I said before about how we have limited knowledge. And so our decisions are always going to be based on the best information that we have available to us at the time. And that's why it's important that we be discerning in our sources of information and do our due diligence to fact check things and to make sure that we rely on experts, especially in areas where we don't have a lot of personal knowledge. And if we've done all of that, and if we've come to a conclusion that this candidate's the best one for the job, and we follow our conscience in voting, and it turns out that that candidate was horrible in office, that doesn't make it a wrong decision on our part, and it certainly doesn't make it a sin, because we were making the best judgment that we could with our conscience based on the information that we had at the time. And in fact, it would be a sin for us to vote otherwise, because the church teaches that it's a sin to act against your own conscience. The conscience is, as I said a moment ago, it's the tool of our intellect that helps us to determine what's right and wrong in any given situation. And now our conscience is not infallible. It can be wrong. And that's why the church teaches us that we have a grave obligation to properly form our conscience. But at the end of the day, our conscience is what guides us in decisions of right and wrong. And that means that it binds us in a way that to act against your conscience is to commit a sin, because it means you would be doing something that you believe to be wrong. And that is subjectively sinful, even if objectively what you were choosing to do wasn't a sin itself. So let's recap here real quickly, right? Just everything that we've just gone over. Voting involves the virtue of prudence, and there are ways that you can sin when voting if you act imprudently. You can sin against prudence by not bothering to pay attention to the relevant information that's available about the candidates, or by not properly considering that information when you make your decision. And you can sin against your conscience if you vote against your best judgment. So yes, there are definitely ways that you can sin when you vote, though these ways that we've just talked about are not usually what people have in mind when they say it's a sin to vote for X, or you can't be a good Catholic or a good Christian and vote for X. What people mean when they say that is that this candidate supports policies that are evil, and to vote for that candidate is to support their evil policies, and therefore it's a sin. And this relates directly to what I mentioned a few minutes ago about political policies that advocate for or support things that are objectively immoral. And I said we'd come back to that. So here we are. Let's look at that now. It was important for us, though, before we did that, to talk about voting in general and how it involves the virtue of prudence and the role that our conscience plays in all of that as kind of necessary background for this discussion now about whether or not we can ever support a candidate that advocates for something that is objectively evil. So the claim is that if we vote for a candidate that supports something that's objectively evil, we share in the guilt for that evil, and therefore voting for that person is a sin. So is that claim true? Well, the church actually has a very well-developed teaching about cooperating in the evil acts of another. It's nothing new, and it has relevance outside of the voting booth, too, and outside of political elections. We as human beings live in a society, and society is where we cooperate with one another all the time, right? We live together, and we're going to be cooperating and working with each other, either intentionally or unintentionally. It's just part of living in community together. Our lives are interconnected. The things that we do are interrelated. Now, we as human beings also sin all the time, right? And so that means that frequently we're going to find ourselves, intentionally or not, cooperating in the sins of other people. The question is, at what point do we share in the guilt of that sin? And the church's answer is, it depends. It depends. There are several things that we need to consider, and we're going to need to make some distinctions. The principles that I'm about to go over now, like I said, apply not only to voting for candidates who might support a policy that's evil, but in any other case where we might be involved somehow in the evil actions of another person, and we're concerned about sharing in the guilt of their sin. And the first distinction that we have to make is between formal cooperation in evil and material cooperation in evil. Right? Formal cooperation and material cooperation. And the difference is this. Formal cooperation means that you are cooperating in the evil act of another person because you agree with it. You are intentionally supporting it because you think it's a good idea. You've given your moral consent to that act, even if you're not engaged in the act yourself. The church says in that situation, formal cooperation, you do share in the guilt of that sin. So, for example, if your friend says, hey, I want to rob a bank. Can I get a ride? And you say, yeah, I think that's a great idea. Let's go rob a bank. I'll drive you. You're guilty of bank robbery, even if you stay in the car and never actually set foot in the bank, right? Or even if you just lend him your car keys and don't actually drive him there, but you let him drive your car, you still share in the guilt of that robbery because you've given your consent to it. You have cooperated in the evil act of another person with intent and with consent. So to put that in terms of voting in an election, if you vote for a candidate who supports abortion, for example, which the church clearly teaches is a grave evil, because you also support abortion and you think that that's a good thing to have wider access to abortion in our country, then you share in the guilt of helping to support a grave evil. Formal cooperation in the evil act of another involves knowledge and consent. In other words, you have to be aware of the evil in question and you have to agree with it. Formal cooperation in evil is always wrong. It will always be sinful. But what if you don't know about the evil act in question? Or what if you know about it, but you don't agree with it, but you still contribute towards it in some way? Well, that's called material cooperation. And the church further distinguishes material cooperation depending on whether it's proximate, meaning near, or remote, meaning far away. So let's say, for example, your friend asks you for a ride to the bank because he wants to rob it. And you don't agree with this. You think robbing a bank is a horrible idea. It's bad. You would never rob a bank yourself. But you agree to drive him anyway because he's already agreed to give you a ride to the airport next month and you don't want him to back out. You figure you owe him a favor. Okay, even though you may not agree with his bank robbery, you've put yourself in a position where you're positively contributing toward the bank robbery in a very immediate way. That would be considered proximate or near material cooperation. And the church would say in that case, yeah, you still share in his guilt, right? Knowledge of the sin always has to be present for us to share in the guilt of that sin. So, for example, if your friend just said, hey, can I have a ride to the bank? And never gave any indication that he was planning on robbing it, you wouldn't share in the guilt of the robbery if you gave him a ride because you had no knowledge of it. What would be an example of more remote material cooperation? Well, let's say you work at a tire shop and you install the tires on the car that was driven to the bank robbery. Right? Yeah, you contributed towards the robbery in some way, but it was pretty far removed. In fact, you probably had no reason to suspect that the car would even be used in a crime. In that case, you clearly would not share in the guilt of the bank robbery, even though you did, in a way, contribute to it by making sure that the car that they used had good tires, right? But let's say you did know that that car was going to be used in a robbery. Let's say you overheard the owners of the car talking about how they were going to go rob the bank on the corner as soon as they left the tire shop. Well, at that point, you have a decision to make. Do you put tires on the car or not? If you agree to fix the car because you don't have any problem with them going to rob the bank, not your bank, right? It's not anything you would do, but you're not going to stop them from doing it. Well, you're now guilty of formal cooperation with their sin because you've given your assent to it. You said, I'm okay with this. But there might be other reasons that you would go ahead and put the tires on their car, knowing that you were, in a way, contributing to that evil thing they were going to do. Maybe you were afraid for your life, thinking, hey, these guys are criminals and they might kill me if I don't do what they want. Or maybe you just thought, hey, I need the paycheck. I don't care, where the money comes from or what they do with the car once they get it back. I just put the tires on. Right? Do you still share in their guilt, even though you were only remotely cooperating with the sin? Well, what the church teaches in these matters is that the more serious the evil in question is, or the more grave, the more serious or more grave our reasons need to be in order to tolerate that evil. So in that example that I just gave, if you were afraid for your life, that's a serious reason. But if you just wanted the paycheck for putting the tires on and you didn't care where it came from, yeah, that's a much less serious reason. So let's apply this to the voting booth, because that's what we're talking about, right? If we vote for a candidate who supports an objective moral evil, that can either be formal or material cooperation. If we vote for that candidate because we agree with and consent to the evil that they advocate for or support, then we are guilty of formal cooperation in that evil that they endorse. And so, yes, we would share in their sin. On the other hand, if we vote for a candidate without agreeing to the objective evil that they advocate for, that would still be remote material cooperation, because we are in a way contributing towards that evil, but it's at a removed distance. We're not engaged in the evil act ourselves, but we're giving our support to a politician who then gives their support to those who do engage in that evil act. So does that make it okay? Does that make it good? Well, no, it can never be considered a good, because no one should ever want to make it easier for another person to commit sin. But it might be tolerable in certain situations, in which case we wouldn't share in the guilt of that sin. Like I said, the church gives us guidance here by teaching us that the graver the evil in question, the graver our reasons would need to be for tolerating that evil. So that means if we're considering voting for a candidate who advocates for an objective evil, our reasons for doing so need to be more serious, right? Which is another way of saying more grave than the evil that they advocate for. Now, normally in a political election, that would mean that the other candidate advocates for an even greater evil, and we don't want to see that candidate in office. And so we're literally voting for the lesser of two evils. Now, this is exactly how the future Pope Benedict XVI framed this issue when he addressed it way back in 2004 as the prefect for the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. And he issued a statement on Catholics who vote for pro-abortion politicians receiving communion. And this deals directly with the matter of whether or not it's a sin to vote for a pro-abortion candidate, because the reason why they wouldn't receive communion is because it's spiritually harmful to receive the Eucharist in a state of mortal sin. So the question on whether or not they can receive communion or should receive communion has direct bearing on our question of whether or not it's a sin to vote a certain way. And this is what he said. A Catholic would be guilty of formal cooperation in evil, and so unworthy to present himself for Holy Communion if he were to deliberately vote for a candidate precisely because of the candidate's permissive stand on abortion and/or euthanasia. When a Catholic does not share a candidate's stand in favor of abortion and/or euthanasia, but votes for that candidate for other reasons, it is considered remote material cooperation, which can be permitted in the presence of proportionate reasons. Now, that last caveat is important, because he's not giving blanket permission to vote for a candidate evil as long as you don't agree with that evil, right? He's saying that doing so may be permitted in the presence of proportionate reasons. Proportionate reasons doesn't mean that you like most or even all of their other policies. Proportionate reasons means proportionate to the evil in question. And since the issue that's most often involved in these cases is abortion, one has to take into account how serious a matter this is when considering what might be a proportionate reason to vote for someone who supports abortion. So what is abortion? It's the deliberate ending of an innocent human life in the womb. And on average, 1.5 million abortions are performed in the United States every year. That's 1.5 million deaths annually. That would mean 6 million deaths over the course of a 4-year presidential term. So when we think about other important issues, such as violent crime or terrorism or war or healthcare or tax reform, there's simply nothing else that comes close to abortion in terms of the number of preventable deaths. And that's why many Catholics seem like single-issue voters. It's not that Catholics don't care about these other issues. It's just it's hard to see how these other issues can be considered proportionate to this one. So let's take all of this and apply it to our original question. Is it a sin to vote for X? Let's say someone tells you it's a sin to vote for this candidate, or you can't be a good Catholic or a good Christian if you vote for this candidate. Presumably, the reason why they claim that is because that candidate supports something that's gravely evil. So the first question to ask is that true? Do they actually advocate for something that is objectively evil? Or is this person saying that just because they don't like that candidate's policies or they don't agree with that candidate's policies? Remember what we talked about back at the beginning of this video. We have to make a distinction between policy issues where people of goodwill can legitimately disagree on what the best way forward is, and policies where there is a clear moral teaching of the church that this is a grave evil and can never be supported. And this is not always as cut and dry as you might think, because one candidate might advocate for, say, national health care, right? A national healthcare system, and another candidate supports privatized healthcare. And a supporter of the first candidate might make the claim that Catholics should vote for that candidate, the one who supports nationalized healthcare, because caring for the sick is a corporal work of mercy. And the church teaches that we should love our neighbor. And so we should follow the church teaching and vote for that candidate. But if they claim that because of that, voting for the other candidate who supports privatized healthcare is a sin, they're wrong, because the mandate that we have, that our faith gives us to care for the sick, doesn't compel us to care for the sick in any particular way. We're free to have differences of opinion about what the best way to care for the sick might be. And the candidate who advocates for privatized healthcare, he probably thinks that's a better and more efficient means to provide healthcare for the sick. And so that would be one of those issues where people of goodwill can have legitimate differences of opinion without either side falling into sin. So if the claim is being made that if you vote for X, it's a sin because that person just doesn't agree with their policies, and there's legitimate room for disagreement there within the moral teachings of the church, then their claim is wrong, and we don't need to worry about sinning if we vote for that candidate. But what if the candidate does advocate for something where the church has a clear moral teaching that this is objectively evil and can never be supported, such as abortion or euthanasia or assisted suicide or same-sex marriage? Is voting for that person a sin? Well, if you're voting for that person because you agree with their support for that objective evil, then that constitutes formal cooperation with the evil, and the church does teach that that is a sin. And if we're talking about a grave evil, which all those things that I just mentioned are, then it would be a grave sin. In other words, a mortal sin, to knowingly and willingly cooperate with it. But if you're voting for that candidate despite their support for that evil, then that would constitute remote material cooperation with that evil. And the church here teaches that this may or may not be a sin, depending on whether or not there were proportional reasons for voting for that candidate despite their support for something which is objectively evil. And the proportionate reasons would need to be considered against the weight of the evil that they support. Sometimes whether or not something is a proportionate reason is pretty clear. So I can't vote for a politician who supports abortion because I think he would lower my taxes, right? That's not proportionate. My financial gain does not tolerate or justify tolerance of killing 1.5 million people per year. But sometimes the reasons for voting for a pro-abortion candidate might not be so cut and dry. Remember, voting is an exercise of prudence, which means we have to take into consideration all of the available relevant information when we make our decision. And part of that information is the candidate's character and trustworthiness. So maybe this candidate claims to support pro-life positions, but maybe I think they're only doing that for political advantage and they don't really mean it. I can't trust them to actually do anything to curtail abortion once they're elected into office. Or maybe the candidate is against abortion, but I'm seriously concerned that their foreign policies might lead us into a nuclear war that would kill billions of people. Or maybe they are against abortion, but I'm afraid that their environmental policies might destroy the planet, and within a generation or so, it would, again, lead to the deaths of billions of people. Or maybe I just can't see how it's moral to support either candidate because they both advocate for policies that I, think are gravely sinful. And so I decide instead to vote for a third party candidate or not to vote at all. Now, someone else might come in and say, I'm allowing my fear about what might happen get in the way of doing something that's good right now about ending abortion. And they might be right. They might be right about that. Or they might claim that if I don't hold my nose and vote for the lesser of two evils, then effectively I'm voting for the other guy because I'm just going to throw my vote away by voting for a third party. Or if I don't vote at all, I'm not doing my proper duty as a citizen, and that's a sin. Well, maybe they're right about those things. But those are all matters of prudential judgment. And all we're talking about in this video right now is whether or not it's a sin to vote for a particular candidate. So, is it a sin if you think you have proportionate reasons for voting for someone who supports a grave evil, and someone else disagrees and says, no, that's not a proportionate reason? In other words, is it a sin to be wrong about what constitutes a proportionate reason? And the answer is maybe. Maybe. And here we have to go back to the virtue of prudence, which is why I wanted to talk about that first. Using prudence when you vote means considering all of the relevant information, meaning the policies of the candidate, the policies of their political party, as well as the character of the candidate, and making a judgment about what the right way to vote is, and then putting that judgment into action by voting. And if you vote for a candidate that supports grave evil, because you agree with and support that evil, then you're formally cooperating with that evil, and that is a sin. If you vote for a candidate that supports grave evil, despite their support for that evil, without having proportionately grave reasons, that's also a sin. But it's not the same sin as formally cooperating with evil. It would be the sin of imprudence, because it would mean that either A, you didn't properly consider all the relevant information that you should have when making your decision, or B, you didn't properly form your conscience to guide you in making a right decision about the best way to vote. And that may or may not be a grave sin, depending on the severity of your negligence in those matters. So, my bottom line is this. It is possible to sin when voting, because voting has moral implications and it requires us to exercise the virtue of prudence. So we should think and pray very carefully about who we vote for. But if you've done due diligence in your research and you've carefully considered all of the relevant information, including what the church teaches when it comes to issues of grave, objective evil, and you've made a prudent decision about the best way to cast your vote, you're not guilty of sinning just because another Christian in good faith came to a different conclusion than you did. I know that deciding which candidate to vote for can be a difficult decision for many of us, especially when we're faced with a choice between candidates and, each one of them seems morally problematic. And I know many Christians are rightly concerned about voting virtuously in a way that does not support objective evil. We should all be concerned about that. But as I said at the beginning of this video, I can't tell you who to vote for. But I hope that by going over these principles that are involved in the question of whether or not voting for a certain candidate would be a sin, that I've given you the tools that you need to be able to cast your vote with a clear conscience. I hope that you've benefited from this episode of CCM In-Depth. Next month, for the month of November, we're going to be looking at Catholic teaching around praying for the dead and what we believe about purgatory and heaven and hell. So hope you join us again for that. In the meantime, please pray for us and for our ministry, and we'll be praying for all of you. Praise be Jesus Christ.